Good day, friends. Welcome to yet another Word of Gord, another in our Average Folks in the Afterlife series. Our third reading from Jürgens Yu's Vistas of Infinity. The third issue of one of the world's most brave, curious, and self-analytical OBE explorers. You will go a distance to find anything quite as provocative as this. And although I've read from many of the older books, channeled books, automatic writing books, there is nothing quite like first-hand experience. And Jürgen is giving us plenty of that. This third section, more from the lower astral worlds. There's always more to learn about that. And there's more variety than one might expect from initial inspection. So he goes through his introduction, his meditation, and here we are. I was in OBE and clearly in a consensus environment, but it wasn't what I had expected or what I had wished for. I was obviously on one of the lowest dimensional subdivisions. The atmosphere was dark, murky even, just like before nightfall, except that the air appeared to be polluted with a tangible fog around me that felt like a cobweb. This was not a place where I wanted to remain. In order to escape without having to return to my physical body, I started chanting the Om mantra. This only had the effect that it lifted me off the ground, but somehow I couldn't summon the energy to lift me into a higher state. No matter how intensely I focused on the mantra, I seemed to be stuck in this plane. Finally, I accepted the inevitable, trusting that if the mantra didn't lift me, consciousness was having deeper reasons for keeping me here. I slowly descended to the ground, taking up the challenge. I felt serenity and stillness inside, despite the shady place, but I was not alone. The place was populated with shadowy people hiding in dim corners. The atmosphere was distinctly bland, if not unpleasant. Through the dark, gooey mist, I saw the outlines of city buildings, huge, windowless industrial blocks. Yes, the lower astral cities are ghetto-like and unpleasant. The streets were dirty and ramps led up to some elevated pavements. A dead, leafless tree emphasized the desolation. Fortunately, where I was, the area was more illuminated, perhaps for about 10 feet, and then it fell off into darkness. Although my state of mind provided a safe detachment from this world, I had second thoughts. No reason emerged for me being here, and I reconsidered, calling on a previous guide who had helped me out when I got stuck. I called out, but there was no response. Instead, a man appeared, covered in layers of rags, the top one an old army parka underneath a dirty blanket, falling down halfway to cover a pair of old, worn-out jeans. He stopped and addressed me. "Can I help?" For a moment I thought it was my guide, and momentarily a weight was lifted from me. But it couldn't have been. He was too poor-looking and too badly dressed. The man laughed at my confusion. "You look lost," he said. "Ideally, I would like to get out of this place, but I seem to have got stuck, and for some reason which is not clear to me. I can't figure it out. Something seems to be holding me here." He told me that not every part in this region was as gloomy as this, and it depended on people to make the best of it. He told me that not far from here was a small community of people and I should try to get in contact with them. Maybe they could help me or I could help them. "Come with me," he said, and I followed him as we set off through the dark, dense smog, shadowy entities scuttling past us. That's just classic. The dark, dense smog and shadowy entities scuttling past us. Oh my, it is so like that. Throughout this time I couldn't see his face, which was buried under a large hood with shawls wrapped around his neck, preventing any remnant of the puny light illuminating his face. Finally, in the distance, I saw a glimmer of light, which at first I mistook for a fire incident. The light came from a piece of wasteland between half-derelict blocks of houses. It seemed to be illuminated by a small group of people who were tending a bonfire. As we got closer, I could make out 3 women and 2 men who were laughing and indulging in banter. Immediately I saw that it was this event that had raised the level of the atmosphere around them and added to the light, and indeed kept their bonfire alive. It was only then that I noticed part of the light that illuminated my immediate surroundings was actually cast by me, as if I was some oversized glowworm. Immediately I drew all the attention and was greeted with interest and smiles. I told them that I was a temporary visitor, but was keen to reach some higher level. Unfortunately, I seem to have lost the knack of overcoming the heavy atmosphere here. I wonder whether they knew of a way out of this world. A woman covered in a discoloured rag, which at one stage might have been a summer dress, laughed at me unabashed. "Do you honestly believe we would still be in this God-forsaken place if we knew a way out of here? Look around you. Do you think there is a place anybody in their right mind would choose to live in? Here? Anyway, why are you asking us? We should be asking you." I wondered what she had seen in me I couldn't see myself. I felt I had no power. The best I could do, I felt, was to terminate my experience by returning to physical consciousness. The environment was bleak to the point of being hostile. Wherever my eyes glanced, I saw a derelict cityscape. Not all of it was in ruins, though. The bits that weren't towered as oppressive, dark, and windowless monuments into the night. Massive brick buildings with no other purpose than to intimidate the inhabitants and make them aware of their powerlessness and their smallness. This was a dark city, like some monstrous aberration out of a horror movie. "Why are you even here?" the other woman wanted to know. "Maybe it is you who has come to guide us out of this place. We have been here for ages, not leaving a stone unturned to find an escape. But you are carrying a light which none of us possess, and it may help us escape." I told them the only way I knew was to lighten the emotion by focusing on an inner serenity that could lift them up. Momentarily, I focused on my heart, which instantly brightened the whole area and gently lifted me off the ground, then stationed me 2 or 3 meters in mid-air. At once 3 of the people grabbed my legs and tried to hitch a lift. I struggled to rise into the air, but the burden became too great. I rose to about 10 meters, but then felt the energy drain from me as the 3 heavy bodies pulled me back to the ground. I told them they had to let go or summon a more positive attitude, that I didn't have the strength to carry them on my own. 2 of them released me, but the woman with dark stringy hair clung on to me for dear life. I shouted to her to focus on her heart to become lighter, but she just stared at me despairingly, obviously not even grasping my meaning. Knowing that without her inner connection to the light, she would only be a burden to herself and me, I suggested she should let go. To make my way out, I wanted to shake her loose, but I knew that wasn't possible. She clung to me tightly as I clearly signaled my intent to escape. Almost instantly, I felt the pangs of regret and compassion, and instead of disentangling myself, I sank with her back to earth. At ground level, I apologized to the group and said I was very sorry that I didn't have enough power to take them with me. I squatted down, joining the group. Everyone was resigned and quiet. All I felt was great pity for the people stranded here. I considered giving a lecture that they needed to start focusing their attention on their hearts in order to leave this region, but I knew this would fall on deaf ears. Being thus immersed in their gloom, I could think of no other way than to enter meditation. I cannot say what effect this may have had on the group, but the immediate area around me began to brighten before I even closed my eyes. There was simply nothing else for me to do here. In the end, I concluded that all circumstances are projections and appearances, and I left it at that without any further thoughts. With my eyes closed, I went into deep meditation there and then. Within moments, I saw patterns emerging, and I knew I had transcended the place, disappearing from their midst. I was now in a room which was bright and cheerful. The walls were covered in a rich Art Deco pattern, and I noticed people passing through the room, their dresses made out of the same pattern. When I looked at their faces, they too were covered in pattern. This made no sense to me. My impression was that the pattern I had observed when entering meditation had become a projected overlay to my outside scenery. I noticed that everything was tinged by my thoughts and visions of the pattern. I knew that pattern frequently appears at certain stages in meditation, and I reasoned that what was taking place was that I had simply entered an external manifestation of my inner state. With curiosity, I noticed that the patterned people were passing through a door into an outside world. I got up and followed. At once I found myself within a new environment, a new world, much brighter and more elevated than the one I had left. It was daytime. In front of me was a tree with rich green leaves, a type of green one would find in late spring when nature is at its most vigorous. Beyond, I saw the scene opening into a large square surrounded by houses of a big city. It became quickly apparent that I was by no means on a very elevated level, though it was far better than the one I had just left. The atmosphere was still of a lower dimensional quality, more earth-like, but at least it was daytime and the people here were acceptably dressed and more human, average to attractive looking. I briefly considered returning to meditation in order to elevate to much higher states, but to my surprise I was greeted by a young vivacious woman with brown hair curling down to her shoulders. She invited me to come with her, using pervasive talk of a nice restaurant where they served interesting Japanese food. I think you will enjoy it, and I can see you could do with a bit of enjoyment. I immediately took the cue and saw it as a significant marker to return to investigative mode. I also figured that the remnants of previous burden of the people and their condition I had just left behind must have still been showing on my face to evoke pity in the woman. She just laughed and took my hand, and pulled me along through the crowded streets. Suddenly something stopped me abruptly in my tracks. Letting go of her hand, I signaled to the girl to go ahead by herself. But after 100 meters she stopped, waving at me to follow her. Instead, my attention was drawn to another young woman in a green dress, standing not far away at a street corner. Her head was lowered and she didn't look at me, but I clearly felt her thoughts with a familiar intensity. She was just standing there, waiting. With a startle and a jolt in my heart, I recognized her. It was my mother. I rushed towards her and we hugged. I then took her in my arms. She looked into my eyes and smiled. "How long have you been here?" I wanted to know. "Why didn't you call out to me at once?" "I didn't want to interfere in what you were doing, as you seemed to have company," my mother said. I told her that this was nonsense, that seeing her was the most important thing to happen to me in a long time, and I was glad to see her. I was holding both her hands and looked at her with amazement. She was half a head smaller than me, and, as before, she still looked very young and pretty, barely like the photographs I knew of her as a young woman. How she had changed yet again since the last time I saw her. She wore a light green summer dress, which ever so slightly exposed the skin at the top of her youthful breasts. It was very strange seeing the person I had always categorized into an older generation and a parental authority as a young girl who could easily be half my age. Yet the quite unmistakable aura and charisma of my mother was clearly still there. I felt an incredible warmth towards her, and an unspoken love radiated back from her. I told her how she looked different every time I met her, and if I didn't know her that it was her, from her looks alone I wouldn't have recognized her. I had met my mother not all that long ago and had grown accustomed to the fact that it was only too easy to change her looks in these post-Earth life dimensions, and how difficult it must be to maintain the same appearance in a world which was so much determined by the thoughts and feelings of the people who lived there. I spent a while talking to her, and when asking about the family, I received a wealth of images as she spoke. I became aware that life in these regions still carried on and was not without events. Quite the opposite. She told me a lot of things had happened in her life since she had died 12 years ago, that this life was not without its challenges, and I shouldn't think for a moment that once we are dead, the afterlife would settle into a nondescript experience of peace, placidness, and eternal rest. The mental images and visual scenarios she pumped out as we spoke could not have been more graphic, and I gained a deep and thorough understanding that life and events still happen, relationships unfold, and situations still develop long after we had died. Small note here. I get asked to channel various dead people by various clients at different times. And a year or so ago, I did several sessions for a psychotherapist of indeterminate nationality. I think she would like to keep her privacy. And asked me if I would channel a rather famous deceased psychiatrist who had been at the forefront of the development of psychotherapy and various modern techniques thereof. So Spirit said yes, and then a little while later we did so. And this psychotherapist listened to her talk about her situations with her clients and asked for advice and gave some advice. And at a certain point, and I threw in the odd comment, me, can't shut up. And interesting stuff, psychotherapy. A lot of fairly standard procedures and situations in life, but people with fairly deep, seemingly irresolvable problems looking for assistance. And at some point, she or I or both of us asked about his own practice up there. And he said by all means he did have one. And he continued in part of his afterlife existence as a psychotherapist. And he said something along the lines of, the lower and mid-astral planes are filled with people who have unresolved issues, psychological, emotional, mental issues from this life, things they should have dealt with but didn't even try through denial, or tried and couldn't. So he said he spends quite a lot of time, quote-unquote time, doing that there. Again, she flashed a scene over to me of a man who had cheated her out of money when they were both alive and who now kept begging for forgiveness. Her dislike for this man was intense and she just wanted to be left alone, but there were some other events. Life here in general progresses in new ways which could never develop in the same way on physical planets. I began to understand by what she was telling me how important it was for many people to die in order to further their developmental progress. This was a powerful bit of information, as we on this side often see death as the end of everything. My mother made it clear to me that death is simply an extended form of gathering valuable information and experience, and should never be seen as an end. There are new kinds of intensities in the afterlife which are largely absent on the earth, with greater diversifications of emotions. Of course, theoretically I had always known this, but the way she communicated this with all the attached and graphic images she projected to me as she spoke made it almost my own experience. She told me new challenges opened up here which we could never have dreamed of in our earth bodies, both good and not so good. I had a clear and comprehensive insight and understanding of what she was talking about. Instantly I related this to my brother-in-law, whom I'd only just met a week earlier. 3 years after his death, he was still coming to terms with certain deep-rooted issues which he had never addressed or even been aware of while he was alive. "Shouldn't you go?" my mother asked, pointing in the direction of the girl in the distance who was still waiting and just waving at me as I looked in her direction. Before saying goodbye to my mother, I told her how great it was that I could still meet her after all these years, and even connected with her on a level we had never been able to do while she was still alive. "I am never that far away," she told me as we parted. Rejoining the girl with the dark curls, she led me straight to an open courtyard with tables and chairs. The tables were tastefully laid out with luminous paper lanterns on each. The yard was enclosed by whitewashed walls, finished off with an elaborate oriental wrought iron balustrade on top. Around the perimeter was a buffet and kitchen staff serving food to guests. There was a festive atmosphere. "What do you fancy?" she asked. "I dunno. What do you recommend?" "I'm having fish fingers." I was astonished that amongst this rich spread of delicacies she had picked such ordinary food. But when she led me to the table and picked up her fish fingers, I noticed that they were the most astonishing and unexpected variety of fish fingers I had ever come across. Sadly, this is where my excursion abruptly ended, as I was woken into physical consciousness by an urgent need to visit the bathroom. An unglamorous end to what had promised to be an interesting time on the astral plane. Yes, amusing ending there. And you will find as you work on these projections yourself, such things do happen with annoying regularity. Loud bangs out in the street sometimes do it too. Yes, trucks going by or somebody throwing something metallic off the end of a pickup truck or something. Anyway, move on to the next one. My wife's mother had died on Friday the previous week. This is from 28 March 2010. She had suffered a chest infection and was kept on her bed for 2 days running. Although Julia saw her twice on the day she died, she was distraught that she had missed the signals and hadn't stayed until the end. She simply thought all her mother needed was rest and she would feel better the next day, so she left early. We were called by the care home at about 8:15, being informed that her mother had died about 7:45. Instantly we went to see her. Her eyes were closed, her mouth open. She was lying on her back. A carer had placed a flower on her chest. Somehow she looked serene, almost beautiful, despite the wear and tear of her 90 years. When my wife kissed her on the forehead, she was still warm, but it was obvious that her body was an empty shell, like a discarded coat. I have seen a few vacated bodies, and every time it was proof to me that the person who had occupied it could not simply have vanished and disappeared. Such concentrated and powerful individual energy just does not vanish. There is too much of it for it to simply dissolve into nothing. Julie and I saw the same thing. There was no sadness, no sense of loss, because we both felt there was nothing that could get lost. The 90-year-old body was empty, but her mother was still alive, gathering a new mantle of energy in another location. Wise words. A week had passed. I got into the habit of placing the intent of out-of-body excursions at the weekend so I wouldn't be interrupted by business calls. Saturday would have been a good time, but I had a busy day ahead of me as I accepted a job late Friday to be completed over the weekend. Sunday was the best choice. I got out of bed about 5:30 in the morning. Julia reminded me sleepily that the clocks were going forward, that we ought to get up earlier. I told her that I would try and see if her mum was okay. I went into meditation and started focusing awareness on being. My mind was like a placid lake. No thoughts there to disturb my peace. The only thoughts I allowed in were concerning Julia's mother. I thought what it would be like to conjure up a bunch of flowers while in the next dimension and then hand it to her as a beautiful bouquet. In my mind I assembled a colourful assortment and wrapped it up in stylish gift paper. Then I turned to the sutras for deep meditation. After about an hour I noticed that I had dropped off to sleep and decided to go to bed with a strong resolve to wake up in the next dimension. No more than 10-15 minutes after dropping off, I woke up in midair, realizing I had left my body and was drifting higher and higher through the ceiling into a bright morning sky. Instead of cloud, I rose through welcoming coloured mists. This told me I was utilizing a much finer energy body. My first thought was to call for Julia's mother, but another more urgent thought occurred to me. I had to meet Julia's brother first. He had died more than 3 years ago of lung cancer, and the last time I saw him out of body, he was in great mental distress. I could hardly make out what he was talking about, and when I had to leave him, I had the impression that he was embarking on a giant task to sort out a number of personal issues. Meeting him would serve two purposes. Firstly, I wanted to know how he was, and secondly, it would be great to have his company while visiting his mother. By now the coloured mists had cleared, and I found myself drifting through another world of drawings, littered with cartoon figures almost like giant murals all around me. I had entered some giant thought form inadvertently. Not again, I thought. What is this nonsense? Instead of ridding myself of the thought forms, I called John's name. As soon as I called, the cartoon drawing melted away, and instead I saw John walking towards me through a stone-lined corridor. He looked serious, with pasty-coloured skin, just the way I remembered him from when he was still alive. He smiled when we shook hands, and I felt a wave of affection towards him, which immediately brought colour back to his face. Where are we? I wanted to know. We are actually in Dorchester, he told me in a matter-of-fact way. Not the physical Dorchester, of course. Let me show you around. We came out of the walled tunnel and entered a wide open square. I saw the cathedral, also a big open market square, but nothing that looked in any way familiar, as I had never actually been to Dorchester. There were people around, but it was not at all crowded. Why Dorchester? I asked. I like the town, John answered. I like the history of this place, and it has rather a unique and pleasant atmosphere which suits my mood. Of course, as you can see, this is on a much higher level. And yes, there are higher levels of all towns and cities and communities. A lot of dead Americans really like the villages in Vermont. They're like the villages in the physical Vermont, but they're all pretty and no ugly. Same with the smaller mountain towns in Colorado. That's just a couple quick personal references there. I was aware of a pleasant light and atmosphere in the place, and I took it as a clue to deepen my sense of wakefulness. With that, I felt a new sense of wholeness, or perhaps security, which was difficult to define, but so typical of some of the higher domains of non-physical reality. You realize, of course, I said to my brother-in-law, I am not dreaming, that I am fully awake and out of my body, talking to you here in full possession of my faculties. I somehow wanted him to be impressed, because when he was still alive, he never took much notice of my out-of-body adventures. I know, he said, I wish I'd paid more attention. Did you expect your afterlife to be like this, I wanted to know? Not at all. I imagined it to be like Father Christmas bestowing all his presents on the children who had behaved well. What I found out was not at all what I expected. For a start, I didn't imagine that it could be so brutally real. By that I mean that all the fairy tales and airy-fairy descriptions we read so much about have little to do with reality. Reality was what struck me most. There is no pretending here. The most painful learning experience for me was that what I pretended to be was not really who I am. I was struck by John's honesty. We had never talked like this all the time I'd known him. He had always kept up the appearance of an enigma and guarded his private self, buying into the persona of a wise man who knew all the secrets of life, but just would not let on to anyone what they were or the true depth of his pretended wisdom and knowledge, which mostly came from reading. He was also a Cambridge graduate and teacher. His fondness for Oscar Wilde also bled into his demeanour with a certain sense of humour, and as a result he was more respected by the people he knew, but not many were allowed through the veneer of his persona into his heart. I only ever saw him vulnerable once, when his short marriage disintegrated, but even in that last week before he died in our house, surrounded by his closest family, he managed to maintain a strong enigmatic persona. And on his deathbed he looked stoic, like an Indian chief about to enter the eternal hunting grounds, not a flicker of weakness. I could not help but admire his attitude. His face looked noble, heroic, but he would not allow the ravages of his illness or the severe pain to tear down his mask. The only sign that he was suffering was that he would reach for the morphine bottle. With an air of distinction, he would unscrew the lid and take a couple of gulps, as if he were sampling a new variety of exotic liquor. Then he would close his eyes with his chin up, wait for the effect of the morphine to kick in. I had never met anyone in my life who had fought so valiantly and bravely against his impending death. When I asked him once whether he was all right when he was bending over in pain without so much as a facial expression, pretending he was just relieving an annoying muscle strain, the simple answer I received was, "It could be worse." Now we were here, both together. His face had mellowed. There was warmth and compassion in his eyes. "You know, John," as I said as I looked into his eyes, "all my life I wanted to be your friend, but you never let me. I felt very sorry that we missed out on a good and meaningful friendship." Then John did something that I would never have expected. He took my hand and pressed it affectionately. "I am very sorry, Jürgen," he said. "I didn't even know myself. I was so full of ideas of what life should be like that I didn't develop the ability to learn to enjoy life as I should have." We sat down together on the pavement. John was still uncharacteristically holding my hands, and I reciprocated to let him understand from my heart that I felt a strong affection and friendship for him, and that it had only been suspended. For the first time I felt its full force and saw in his eyes that he felt sorry and that he really felt a deep appreciation and very brotherly love for me. I noticed a bit further to my right a woman dressed in white who had been eavesdropping on our conversation. She immediately apologized and confessed that she couldn't help but be part of this conversation and said how it moved her. Rarely had she been so deeply touched by a scene of true friendship like this. With that, she walked over to her partner, who stood a little further away, also dressed in a white suit, and they both strolled off. It was then that Julia turned up. She was uncharacteristically dressed in a bright blue dress and looked young and vivacious. She started chatting to her brother as if they had never been far apart. I watched the two conversing and wondered what had happened. Julia, too, as his own sister, had never been allowed into his private world, but here they were, chatting like old siblings. A moment later she had disappeared. John noticed my astonishment. I am never far away from my dear sister Julia. I have learned a lot since I arrived over here. It was absolutely necessary for me to die because I had to die in more ways than one. Death is not some sort of punishment, but a great learning opportunity. When your life won't allow you to expand your wisdom, then death very often offers you new opportunities and may be the only way. During our conversation, John and I decided to carry on with our casual stroll around town. We kept talking intensively and philosophically until I noticed we had begun circling the same block for the second time. He was telling me about his experiences since he had died, how confused he was at first and how little he valued the people now who he had looked up to when he was still alive, and how those people were not as worthy as he had hoped. He also told me he had taken an interest in classic Greek theatre. That's all that 2,000-year-old stuff. Aristophanes and all the rest of it. "Have you been to higher levels?" I wanted to know. "Yes, I have. Some much higher than this. I see this as my halfway home. It's pleasant. I quite like it. The higher levels I've only visited, so I can't see them as my home yet." I asked him whether he had seen his father, who had died about 10 years ago. He told me that his father had gone on a solitary quest into some totally unfamiliar regions for him. He was on some kind of a quest, and that he had embarked on a journey that was of great importance for his personal development. I wondered what happened to his father's relationship with his wife who had just died, and why he was away. He told me that even such long relationships as his parents were no guarantee that they belonged together when coming over here, and that relationships were more based on the intensity of inner bonds. I then remembered the whole reason why I'd come over here in the first place, to look in on Julia's mother. I asked John whether he could help find her. To my great surprise, John was rolling a cigarette and then lit it with his old army lighter. He took a deep puff and blew the smoke into the air with a satisfaction I could feel myself just by looking at him. I laughed out loud. "So, you are still smoking then?" I found this very amusing. Smoking had always been a powerful component in John's life. He had built a whole ritual around his smoking, keeping his roll-up tobacco in a tin with a Buddha picture of mine, which I had given him for his birthday. He would take out the tray, place his brown licorice cigarette papers, tobacco filters, and lighter onto the tray, and then start rolling at great leisure his little joints, which he would then line up neatly. After he had rolled his daily supply, he would transfer it into a silver 19th century cigarette case, which he then put into his pocket. Then he would go outside, smoke, and cough. It was the cigarettes, of course, which killed him, and here he was indulging in his old pastime. "They won't kill me now," he said with a broad grin. "That's the beauty of life here. You can still enjoy your sins." Oh, I'd like to see some Christians react to that. I started on my second task that I had set myself during meditation, namely to conjure up a bunch of flowers to give to Julia's mother, but I was distracted by John's smoking habit and his rolling of cigarettes. When I looked at my hands where I expected the flowers to materialize, I found to my utter astonishment a bunch of flowers made out of cigarette papers. John laughed out loud and told me that I couldn't focus on two things at the same time. By this time, I thought the flower trick was too attention-consuming and I abandoned it. Instead, I asked John whether it was possible to see his mother. "We could try," he told me. I thought it would be a good idea to try the same method as I employed when I called John. I turned around and shouted very loudly into the market square, "Mum!" But Mum didn't materialize. Instead, I noticed heads turning and people trying to find out what my call was all about. I felt embarrassed having drawn this unwanted attention. I decided the next call should be done on a more mental level. This time I received a clear image in my mind of Mum, with a much younger appearance and light brown hair. I instinctively knew that she wouldn't be able to join us. John told me that she was still in an adjustment phase and it would be some time before she could manage to appear on this level, which was not what she could accomplish at this stage. I took comfort in the fact that I had at least glimpsed an impression of her and that I could tell Julia on my return that she was okay. My second thought was that I could use my out-of-body state to visit her and do some other investigation on my checklist. But I thought I needed to return while this event was still fresh in my mind in order to record it accurately. And thank you for doing so, Jürgen. Another amusing and instructive set of adventures. Friends, I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll return again sooner than you think.